Hello again, real talk with our community. This is the Impact Movement. We're going every other week now. And again, tonight, I got a co host again. She's back, Michaela Powell. Show her some love, people. Clap, clap, clap. Show it up, show it up, show it up. She's from LSU. And tonight, we're going to talk to our partners. We have one of our dear partners. It seems like years, but it's only the last 3 years. The Allender Center is with us of the Seattle School. And that's important. The Allender Center is a center within the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. And so my friend Michaela here, my co-host, is going to introduce the first two guests who's coming on to be with us.
All right, so with us, our first guest is Rachel Clinton Chin from Oklahoma and currently residing in Philadelphia with her husband and two stepsons. She received her bachelor's at Oklahoma Baptist and a Master of Divinity from the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, and is the current director of teaching and care for the Allender School. And then next we have Jen Oyama Murphy, and she is currently the Manager of Leadership Development at the Allender Center. She received her bachelor's in English at Yale University and seeks to engage those who have felt oppressed and marginalized.
Excellent. And so now joining us is the president of the Seattle School of Theology, and he's our first return guest, Derek McNeil. Bring on the president. There he is. And then we have the founder of the school and the founder of the Allender Center. He's an interesting guy. I think he's on an island somewhere in Washington. Dan Allender is going to join us as well. There he is. So we want to say grateful for having all you guys. This is maybe our third, fourth installment about trauma and resilience. We've been talking about trauma. We have Wendell on. We had Linda the last time with Michaela and I. Do us a favor tonight if you can. And Rachel, just describe what is trauma, if you can give us a definition to work with.
Ooh. Well, I'll do my best and then let anybody else jump in and add to it. Because I think it's important to define it well, because it's a word that's used a lot. And I typically go with like a very simple definition for like big T trauma, just that it's an experience of the threat of annihilation. So again, it doesn't have to be, it's the threat of annihilation, but also the experience of annihilation. And I think it's really important to name that it is beyond personal. We have personal experiences of trauma, but it can be historical, intergenerational, and personal. So there's this reality of it being like something that extends far beyond us, that we're connected to in our communities, but also have our own personal experiences. So it can be really compounding as well.
Okay.
And I would like to ask Jen and Derek to describe how trauma affects our ethnic groups.
I'm Jen. I'm gonna let you
go first. Okay.
Tackle that first.
I think there are actually a lot of Asian countries that don't, and cultures that don't even have a word for trauma, because I think, at least for my culture, I'm Japanese American. We don't. So for me, trauma is something that we experience that is so like too much for our bodies, too much for our systems to handle, too much for our minds to handle, too much for our hearts to handle. And so much of my culture is built on our capacity to absorb and handle a lot. And so we don't sometimes even have a word for trauma because the expectation is that we are going to be able to metabolize it, work through it, do whatever kind of we need to do to get beyond it. And so it's kind of this category that we read about or is kind of out there for other people and is not something I think within the Asian community that we have language for. And if we don't have language for it, then we don't know what to do with it. And so, I would say we don't know what to do with trauma because we don't really understand it and don't let ourselves experience it. And so then don't really get healing from it.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I'm going to piggyback on that because I think as adding to the definition of kind of when your systems are overwhelmed and you're not able to adapt and respond. And I think, this personal story, as an African American, I probably was also not allowed to think of myself as having trauma. And that in some ways it is expected for us to live through a lot and to keep going. There's a term now that's emerging called weathering, and this notion of you're expected to weather the storm. But I think as we think about it now, for instance, the disproportionate death of African Americans in COVID-19 is a statement of how weathering is sufficient in the moment, but deteriorates your body over time. And so I think it has been the issue of cultural coping is what you're raising, Michaelia. And I think for each group, the ways they conceptualize trauma or the way they conceptualize being overwhelmed, or they're told they can't be overwhelmed, they have to keep working through it, has shaped some of the coping strategies and styles of different cultural groups.
Wow. So, and we should say to our audience that we're not just talking about a sweeping conversation of trauma as just a generalized reality. We're talking about trauma as it relates to the issues we're facing today. The trauma of COVID-19, but especially the trauma of racism that we're experiencing in our country. And so if we tapped into this idea of what Rachel said about annihilation, about a memory, about his personal, I want to talk to Dan now, because that gives me the impression that trauma can only be something that the oppressed experiences. Is that true? Or is it possible for the majority to experience trauma as well?
Well, if we think that trauma is a common reality to that sense of annihilation, and it doesn't mean that trauma has to be based on fact, it can actually be based on perception. So the fact is, trauma always involves some degree of shame. And I think particularly for white privilege, there's always the sense that there is a harm that as a white man, I don't suffer in the same way that my President Derek experiences. So already that sense of difference creates isolation, but it also creates a sense of shame. And wherever there's shame, there's always going to be a propensity to blame shift, to find somebody to scapegoat. So the moment we feel shame, we want somebody to be at blame for that. And yet it doesn't help, because the blame actually creates more damage. So those who perpetrate any form of harm against others will eventually, by virtue of being made in the image of God, experience some degree of that shame. How we handle that shame, when we blame shift and scapegoat, we create even more of an enemy, and therefore more sense of fear. So the two things that I would bring here is, when you have shame, you want to blame. But when you have fear, you want to find some degree of safety. And so white flight, I think it's an intersection of shame and fear that requires a scapegoat, and then a form of creation of a world apart from all sense of difference in order to create a new sense of safety. So what we're looking at with all forms of white privilege is a trauma that is in that sense self-inflicted. So you can be traumatized by others, but you can also create trauma for yourself.
Wow. Michaela, I want to just ask a secondary question to Jen, because he introduced trauma and shame together. Can you help me understand, Jen, when you hear him saying that shame is attached to trauma, and shame is a button in the Asian American community, what happens to you in your thought process? Do you connect with it, or is there a contrast with that?
Well, like as Dan was talking about both shame and fear, I feel like I have both those things residing in my body most of the time. So especially right now, in the midst of COVID, in the midst of all the racial injustice being seen and named, I feel like I'm both the oppressed and the oppressor. Right, so I have the shame around being the oppressor and the ways that I've been complicit and have colluded with white privilege and white supremacy. And I also feel the fear of someone who can resonate with some of the experiences of Black Americans and Indigenous people and Latinx people. And like, so I'm holding both of those things in my body at the same time. And I don't do a very good job of naming either of them. I don't do a very good job of really owning and putting language, again, I think kind of going back to my culture of not really having adequate language to name what's happening for me in my body. And everything that I'm feeling and experiencing, I'm orienting myself in comparison to whiteness. Like how I am on the field of shame and fear, and whether or not it's okay for me to feel those things, I'm locating myself against whiteness. I'm comparing myself in terms of, do I have value? Am I at fault? Could I be doing something different? Do I belong? I'm using whiteness kind of as my standard, and like part of my work, I think, is to use Jesus as my standard, not even like my own people or somebody else, but it's how do I locate myself in my shame and my fear around Jesus, and that's been a hard thing to do, a lot harder than I thought it was.
Wow. I feel like we need to stay with this for a second, because as I hear this, Michaela, about fear and shame, I'm thinking about George Floyd. I'm thinking about Ahmaud Arbery. I'm thinking of Breonna Cooper. I'm thinking about the recent gentleman that was killed running away from the cops. Derek, it feels like there's fear and shame in us just for being Black.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
Yes, and I think I might suggest that some of our adaptive and maladaptive habits are a mixture of that. Adaptive in the sense of, what I have in my head is my mother moaning and rocking and in church and music. And the ways I dealt with fear has been through music, or it has been through physical activities. It's, the sort of need to play basketball, if you will, to me is some degree of trying to relieve my body of both its terror and its shame. And there's also, I would say, as a young Black man, I felt this more strongly, the desire or need to outwork white people to avoid shame on me. So I used to have a mentor who used to say to me, he gave a John Henry syndrome. And the story of John Henry is that John Henry would work against, and he would beat a machine, a steel driving machine, but then he, at the end of winning, would drop dead and die. And so the sense of my death is an attempt to avoid shame or the terror of fear, in some ways. So I think the coping, again, this is why there's sort of unique coping. I have been stopped by the police at times, and it's interesting how angry you get as opposed to frightened. It's actually a chance for my fear to turn into an action. And so we ask questions of why would you fight the police? Well, it's an interesting sort of rage that comes up when you feel like you've been stopped for no good reason. And sometimes it can be one that can cause your demise, or put you in a situation that's more at risk, even when it's for something that feels inane. So I think the complexity of this in terms of what our bodies are holding is quite challenging. And sometimes, as Jen said, we don't have words for it. It is very seldom that we allow Black folk the privilege of having trauma, if you will. I remember this when Michael Brown, it wasn't so much his death that got me, but his laying in the street for how many, 4 hours uncovered.
Yeah, just blood everywhere.
I couldn't think of, is he not human? And I think the other challenge for me in terms of, say, a George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery is it's hard for me not to practice. Could I hold my breath if someone's held me against a car that long with their knee on my neck? And I find myself practicing, can I hold my arms behind my back and could I survive that? And so I find myself stretching, like, well, at some point, if I'm going to be arrested, can I breathe that way? So it's hard to separate in a mirror neuron sort of way that sort of terror and shame that I am that weak that you could do this to me. And I think that's what the anger towards police officer is. When I've certainly felt it as a younger person, is like, how dare you do this to me? And, you know, I can recall being frisked on a car, and it was like 3 blocks from my aunt's house. This is when I was living in Philadelphia. And I kept thinking, I don't want my aunt to drive around the corner and see me standing on this police car. Now, that's a strange thing to be thinking, but that speaks to the shame of that, the sort of powerlessness of that, the sort of don't have much choice of that. And I think some of my anger was an attempt to get away from the fear of that as well. So these are things that are complex as part of our coping. We don't think of them as coping, but they're part of our coping strategies that manage both the sense of trauma that expresses itself in shame and fear.
Wow. Michaela, do you have a question?
Miss Rachel, I listened to the podcast that y'all did on the Allen Center, the one about white supremacy, and you talked about how we have been sharing a gospel message that has been sifted through whiteness, or where you talk. I think one of the other members of the podcast, he talked about the Black woman who is mourning, not wanting to lose the image of a white Jesus, which is something that I have found myself having to do, that also struggling with. How would you say that trauma of receiving a white gospel that has been shared for many, many years, how do we begin to break that trauma, or to even break that gospel-centered message and replace it with the true gospel message?
Wow.
It's such a good question. You know, I'm thinking about, my husband and I were actually just talking about this at dinner like an hour ago. I'm thinking about Jen saying, like, I need to be more like Jesus. And I think when that, in some ways, like, I've been thinking a lot about how I need to be able to see. Like, there's something of Jesus saying, I come to give sight to the blind, that I think is very literal to literal blindness. And there's something about being able to see. But it's actually pretty horrifying to be questioning if you've ever actually encountered Jesus. Who is Jesus? And to have to realize, I think, so much about whiteness being tethered to Christianity and the varied ways that that has impacted and all the things that come with that, is this constant centering of the white experience, even in the way scripture is interpreted. So to have to go back, and I would say specifically as a white person, there are a lot of texts that I'm reading very differently in this season of life. Like really having to see myself as the rich young ruler, and questioning, what does it look like for me to enter the kingdom of God? If Jesus is saying it's going to be harder for you to enter the kingdom of God than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, and taking that really seriously. And again, the confusion, I think, the insidious reality that I think as a white person, the posture I need to have in this season, if I get in my body, is repentance, and to undergo grace. And to me, that has been, I will say, I think I have encountered the true Jesus in my interactions with Black and brown people who have extended forgiveness and grace to me that I feel is unearned. And I think that that capacity to understand the gospel differently I think then to have to go back and I just don't know I don't know if anyone actually has a language to be in our bodies. I think that the very nature of evil is to want to dismember us, to disembody us. And I think part of the trauma is, part of the healing from trauma to me is encountering Jesus who has a body, and it's not a white body. It's not a white body at all. And what does that mean? What does that mean about the salvation that he's bringing? It's a start. I don't know if that's actually in any way like a comprehensive answer to your really good question.
So let's build on this, and I want to go back to Dan now. Dan, this is where we're going to kind of pivot a little bit with a little bit more transparency. So the Impact Movement and the Allender Center, we're partners. We're growing partners. And the Seattle School, we're growing partners. So I think it might be important for you, Dan, to first take the question that Michaela presented to Rachel, but first talk about your own journey first. Because, you know, you've been around, you have a history of dealing with trauma, and maybe even talk about your own epiphanies to help people realize that you're ramping in. This has not been something that you integrated over the last 30 years of your career, but this is a part of your journey now that God has introduced to you so that you can give hope for folk that they can get on this ramp too, or get on this road.
Yeah, my work began almost 30 years ago doing work in the area of sexual abuse. And it's impossible to see the trauma of abuse without seeing the reality of fragmentation. I mean, that sense of something divided inside of yourself, divided from others, ultimately divided from God. So fragmentation has not been a new reality. A second reality is this sense of numbness. Something inside goes dead. I don't want to feel, I don't want to dream, I don't want to desire. And that third issue of isolation. So if I can use those three words, fragmentation, numbing, isolation, those are not new categories, but a number of our staff are people of color, and we worked well as we dealt with sexual harm, but more and more conversations came to me with regard to, are you aware of the reality, as Jen and others would say, how Asian women end up being eroticized, how African-American women end up being eroticized? This isn't just a specific event. This is actually a whole cultural phenomena. It may show itself in individual moments, but it's actually the very water that people live, breathe, swim, and breathe in. And so as I began to have conversations, I'll also say that, one that occurred about 4 years ago when you came to join us in the story workshop. I mean, you asked me some questions that left me absolutely staggered. I mean, one was, what about your own racial identity? And that was one of those realities of white privilege. I never thought about having a racial identity. But as you began to ask that question and how I saw trauma being lived out in a more systemic way, again, it's the heartbreak of being able to say, I didn't have to see it and I didn't want to see it. But being in that position of all of a sudden knowing this has been my life work to deal with trauma. And I've also chosen in many ways to allow my own heart, mind, and body to escape levels of trauma that were not personal to my own experience, but were actually deeply personal to my dear friends. So I think that was at least one of the openings that began to help me see, this is a blindness that at some level is cultural, but also deeply personal, in that the cost of beginning to face it meant I not only had to look at my own white privilege and white supremacy, but then I had to begin to engage this publicly in the settings I'm allowed to teach in, and in friendships where there is this, in one sense, desire to make it somebody else's issue. It's not my issue. I don't really see it. It's not really my experience. But those are some of the moments of being able to go, how can I have the integrity to step into the work that evil has done for the sake of redemption when I won't look at the profound effect of trauma in the lives of not just friends, but of a whole culture group. And what makes it harder is a lot of my work began with Indigenous people in Alaska, with Aborigines in Australia. So it's not that I've not addressed racial issues, but dealing with it in my own world and my own country. To look at the level of betrayal and just to know the history. Like until we began reading, thinking, I had so little understanding of like black codes. I mean, the idea that lynching is a form of terrorism. I mean, things that are so obvious to me today, I look at from even 5, 6, 7 years ago and say, I just didn't get it. And at one level didn't want to get it.
So in some ways, Makeda, I know you're going to go next. In some ways, then you get how white people in general can be aloof to the whole issue and just not even pick up on the signs of how people of color are living in trauma in this society and not even aware of it. Is that true, Dan?
Absolutely. A friend of mine asked me a number of years ago, when you get on an elevator, what do you think of when you get on? And I said, what floor I want to be on. And she said, that's not what I think. I think about who's going to be on that elevator, who could do me harm. I traveled to a small little town in Iowa with one of our staff, Wendell Moss. And the experience of being in a small, very white community with an African-American man and seeing the level of terror, just absolute fear he experienced at different times, it was one of those awakenings to go, I do not bear the same risk. I do not bear the same threat. I don't bear the same trauma that he does on an everyday experience. So when I asked him the question, what do you think of when you get on an elevator? His response was the same as that woman. I have to make a decision as to whether or not I'm a threat to them or perceived to be, or whether I will be threatened to get on the elevator. The idea that all I have to think about is what floor I want to get to is just another way of talking about white privilege.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And I think that's so interesting that you mentioned that. I was talking to a friend today and we talked about, as a Black woman, what it's like to get on an elevator. Because we're not only thinking as a Black person, but also as a woman. When a man gets on the elevator, we have a trauma as well that plays a part into that, not only being Black, but also being a woman and being in fear of what could happen. Yes. And Ms. Rachel, I know you talked about the forgiveness that you have received from your Black and brown brothers and sisters. Mr. Derek, I know that your writings touch on forgiveness and peace. And I know that there are some Black people who feel like they are tired of forgiving, that they are tired of constantly having to be the person to go forward and to always take that extra step. What encouragement would you give them as we see our white brothers and sisters wanting to reconcile or wanting to have that veil removed? How would you encourage us to move forward in that?
My goodness, what a tough question. And I'll say it this way, there's a part of my body says, no, I'm not ready to forgive. And part of my decision, knowing that there's only one way forward, and that is to forgive. And so in some ways, it's recognizing the conflict that produces. And it doesn't just conflict in somebody else, it conflicts in me. It's interesting. The notion of forgiveness to me, still, I have not been able to give it without it being earned. And I don't mean earned in the sense of, hey, would you forgive me? But earned in the sense of safety. We've been talking about safety. I still probably need to feel like you can be safe enough for me to forgive you and bring you back close to my breast. Very much different than I can forgive you, but stay over there. And I'm still I can forgive you, but stay over there. And I think for the issue of safety we're talking about, that sometimes there's a forgiveness when I realize you don't understand how you even hurt me, that I still need to hold you off. It's not we have this sort of sense of forgiveness. It means, hey, we come and hug and embrace and we move back. And I still think there's some movement as opposed to a situated position. And there's some ways my body don't feel safe with people. And I can forgive them even their own desire or their own mistake and their error or their missing something. But I still have a certain caution that I'm still working with. And this is where, in some ways, perfect love has not cast out fear in me. So I'll just be honest in that sense. And so I want to say forgiveness with caution and the wisdom of a serpent as we attempt to be harmless in response. Interesting, because this is both the COVID thing particularly, it's interesting. I almost feel with the loss of George Floyd, this is a movie that I've seen over and over and over again. And so there's some numbness, there's some numbness in me with this. I want it to stop, but there's also some numbness. But the COVID thing pushed me into kind of going backwards and looking at stuff that I grew up with. And as a little boy, my mother and father would make me get on my knees and say Lord's Prayer. Every night, I couldn't get into bed before I would do that. And I found myself reading the Lord's Prayer to my staff as a way of me going back for some comfort. So this period has really made me feel quite unsafe. And I was feeling unsafe before George Floyd, but it's pushed me even further with COVID. But I looked at Matthew and read the text, and this goes back to speaking to Rachel's point about rereading the text. And as I read the Lord's Prayer, it doesn't have the last part of it that I've said all my life that I thought Jesus says. For thine is the power, kingdom, and glory. And I said, well, where is that part? That's supposed to be on there. I don't see that part on there. Well, that was an additive thing. That wasn't the words of Jesus. That was a late, ancient additive. But it's interesting, those power words were not there. Jesus didn't offer those power words. What Jesus goes into after he says, deliver us from evil or deliver us from the evil one, goes into and forgive those, because if you don't forgive, your Father in heaven will struggle to forgive you. Now, right after, avoid the evil one, please don't bring us into temptation and deliver us from evil. There's conversation about forgiveness. So forgiveness is essentially a part of surviving. It's a surviving text, not a kingdom has come in this moment text, which is how we pray it. And so in some ways, what Christ is offering us is survival in our forgiveness. That to hold is in some ways maybe to weather, but not to really thrive. And so thriving requires some degree of forgiveness, of letting go, of moving into a different state of relationship. I think that's why we talk about transforming relationships. It is not necessarily because you earn my forgiveness. It's because in some ways I have to bring myself to do so for my own sake, for my own well-being, for my own mental and well-being.
Wow. You know, as I listen to this, it's amazing to me how the moment can drown out history. So if we would go back and just dial back maybe like 7 or 8 weeks ago, before Ahmaud's video was released, before Breonna hit the news, before we actually saw life leave George Floyd's body, we're really talking about xenophobia and racism towards Asian Americans. I mean, it seems like things just flip so quickly. And even now, recently, I'm seeing the emerging now of the Native American narrative, because so many people are dying of in the Navajo reality of COVID-19. So Jen, before I ask you this question, we want to hear from our audience tonight. Please, we want to indulge. They're here for us and for you. So if you're on the Impact Facebook page, or if you're on YouTube channel for Impact, please pose a question. Our staff would gladly bring it up for us to ask this panel of people these questions. So please do that. Go to the Impact Movement Facebook page or to the YouTube page for the Impact channel. So,
Jimmy,
yes?
can I say something about follow up, Derek?
Please, because then I got a question for you.
Right.
Go ahead.
I love what Derek has written and said about transforming relationship, because I feel like that is what is going to change us. And the marching and the protesting and the signing of petitions, all those things are good. I'm in no way saying that they're not. But for that type of forgiveness and transformation, I actually need to put my face in front of another face that doesn't look like mine and have engagement. Like it requires something different of me to sit across from Derek, to sit across from Wendell, to even sit across from Susan or Abby, and to have a conversation around, here's where I know that I have harmed you, and I want to be able to talk about that. And here's how I have experienced you harming me. That requires something different of me and my body than marching down the street or signing a petition or putting something up on Facebook. And again, I'm not saying that those actions are bad or wrong, but they are moving us towards something different than I think transforming relationships move us towards. I mean, I've been thinking about 1 John, and it says that we know who Jesus is because we got to feel him and touch him and see him and hear him. I feel like I want to know who Jesus, the real Jesus is, not the sanitized, blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus. In order for me to experience that, I'm going to have to sit with people and let them see me and hear me and touch me. And I'm going to have to earn, kind of what Derek said, earn the trust where they will allow me to do the same thing. So again, I like the big social justice movements that are happening are necessary and real. But if we only do that and we don't sit down with the people we work with or the people we go to church with or the people in our families and start having those real down and dirty conversations that can lead to transformation and forgiveness, and then I think we've missed something of the power of the cross and resurrection, honestly.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to call that a catalytic. It's a catalytic moment, but not the end of the work. It is something that's pushed us out of our old scenario, mm-hmm. and unfortunately, people died to push us out of our old scenario. It's not enough to just be pushed out of our old scenario. We have to engage the work long term, and that's much more of a relational task.
But again, I think this is where history and not knowing has hurt us. I had the privilege of working with Mrs. King and James Orange, and they taught me the 6 steps, 6 principles, and 3 evils that Dr. King used to do when he would do his movements. And it's interesting, what you're talking about now is very much a part of his strategy. Demonstration was just a move of chess. It was never the end game. It was an idea of how we can confront and love people who hated us. But the strategy was to impose change. And what we need to do, and I think some of the people organizing this are probably have some of these strategies in mind, but the greater masses need to engage this, to understand that it's not just simply what Jen is saying too. There's some structural and some cultural realities that we've got to shift, because this thing is 300, almost 400 years old of us dealing with this. This is not something that just happened after FDR. I mean, this thing is going back centuries for us. I wanted to pose Jen, but I'm going to save this, Jen. Michaela, go ahead and ask your question so we can tip into that world.
So a lot of times we hear people recognize racism as a sin, but a lot of times we fail to recognize that there is evil in there as well. So how, Jen and Mr. Dan, how would y'all recognize or contrast evil and sin?
Wow. Again, what a huge question. But let's just say that, the nature of sin, Jesus talks about in Matthew 5 as lust and anger, or the language that seems like hyperbole, but barely even gets to it, adultery and murder. So the nature of sin is always a kind of absorbing and taking, a stealing, but also then a violence against, a form of murder. But you have to ask, in one sense, who energizes, who creates something of the foundation for sin in that way to play itself out? And again, I'm sure there are differences even on the panel, but my own sense of cosmology is there is evil. Oh, there is evil. And it's not just a force, it's an intention. I've never seen the kingdom of darkness, but whatever it is, it's committed ultimately to those words that I used before, fragmentation, where there is division. I mean, the very name of diabolos, or the devil, it means literally to divide, to create a division. And evil's word, its primary word, Satan, actually comes from what we understand the word to mean accusation or contempt. So when we look at the nature of evil, it's always working to divide, always working to create an inner deadness, and ultimately a commitment to isolation, so that you in one sense go into your own world without being willing to engage the worlds of others. So if you actually take evil seriously, then it's not a externalization of what's happening inside the human heart. It's actually an acknowledgement that evil loves trauma, because it feasts on the effects of trauma, and will wherever there's trauma, evil will be present, spreading lies, creating division, looking to create that inner deadness, and ultimately to make it seem such that you are alone and you will never have true communion and community. So if we can understand that sin, of course, is involved in racism, but there's a larger entity, and it doesn't want it seen. I mean, that's the very nature of evil, is it does not want its structure to be exposed. So the notion that evil is systemic ought to be one of the most obvious things, especially for white people, to acknowledge that it is actually working through systems in order to accomplish its ultimate purpose of division.
Wow. Go ahead. You want to ask Rachel, not Jen. Go ahead, Michaela.
Ms. Rachel, will you add to that?
Well, I mean, I don't know if there's much more I would like add to Dan's nuance. I think the Apostle Paul has a lot of language for this framework as well. This sense of the systemic as it's wired with the personal, this power of sin and death that Jesus actually comes to liberate us from. And that work of sanctification, that is a lifelong work to, in some ways, unbind, to loosen, like that power of sin and death's hold on us. So that's a very abstract, way we talk about this. And so it's just where I go, well, what does that actually look like in our life? What are the powers and principalities that are made up of people and systems? And to me, it's just, one of the most wicked and insidious realities of white supremacy and whiteness and its impact on racism and racial injustice is that, for the most part, in the history of the United States of America, it was perpetrated from within the church, yes, with God's name, using our sacred text. So it's where I go, oh, I also think evil loves to be a false light and a false God. And that to me is where I go, oh yeah, I need Jesus. I actually need to see with clear eyes what we're up against, because I think we're up against something that requires sobriety and like entering with a sense of, we need the Holy Spirit, and not in a cheap way, not in a, I think when I use the word forgiveness, I don't get to nuance the framework I have for that in my work with survivors. And so I think it will take everything we have, and it is a matter of life and death. So, and it is sin. So it doesn't let us off the hook, because these systems, we take them in, we participate with them. And that doesn't have to be the final, that's not the end of the story. It's not our only option. But.
Wow. When I hear you, my youngest son's favorite movie was The Usual Suspects. And the one thing, as I hear you, I think of Kaiser Soze. This whole idea that the greatest trick the devil ever did was to get people to not believe he exists. And what you're trying to help us to realize that evil is not a fiction, it's not something trapped in a novel, but it's really active in our world, at play, to disorientate us, to create this inner deadness within us. So we got our first question right now from the audience. Kate, you want to go ahead? This is from Mary Balote. I think her name is that right? Did I say Balote or Balote? Let's see. You want me to ask? Go ahead, Michaela.
Oh, and it says, how do I ask to talk about how I have harmed without making it about me?
Oh. Derek and Jen, y'all want to take a stab at that one?
I'm going to pass.
All right, Jen.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is a hard, really hard question and a hard dynamic. I think, to be honest, like a lot of times when I want to talk about how I've harmed, what I actually am looking for is some sort of absolution, right? That it is about me. I'm not, I'm wanting something in return. It's a transactional, not a transformational conversation. I'm coming to relieve my guilt because the friendship feels uncomfortable or the relationship feels uncomfortable. And so I'm wanting something in return from the person. So, and I honestly, I don't know if I have a good answer for that. Like, I don't know. Go ahead, Derek.
Well, let me add my answers, probably because I didn't know how to take the question in a little bit. And I'll say that now. I hope that's not hurtful. I think this particular moment is about self-exploration. It is not about how do I rescue somebody else at the moment, but who am I? What has shaped me? What has in some ways shaped the way I view myself and my interactions with other people? So to some degree, there's moments when I can ask the question, how do I take care of you, that I actually avoid what's wrong with me. And I actually need us at this moment to say, what's in me that shaped me this way? And not even for me as someone who's European American, but for me as an African American male. I have a friend who I said to him a couple of weeks ago, we need to consider as African Americans that there might be some place in the world that might value us more than the United States, and consider going there and living in those places and serving in those places, because it would at least break us of the mental attitude or the mental thought that the only place that really wants me and I can go is here. And I was raised with that frame, that the only people who really I can serve are Black people in this country, in my neighborhood. And so I think this is a moment for all of us to ask the question, God, who are we? And who am I? And how have I perpetrated whatever I've perpetrated? And not make it fully, and this is going to sound contradictory to some of the things we said earlier, not necessarily make it fully about how I take care and not harm the other person, but what am I doing to perpetuate shame and fear inside of my body? What's happening inside my body and how am I reacting? And I think sometimes I've experienced people of the dominant culture not knowing what to do. And so it then gets focused on people of color, particularly African. I've had so many people ask me how I'm doing. I actually think I'm doing better than most people. But it's a projective. I'm in conflict because I've not seen this sort of thing before. I don't know what to do with myself and my good God, do you hate me because of it? No, I don't. But I need you to do your work. And your work right now is exploring what's happening inside of me. How have I not seen this before? How has it been a blind spot for me? Whoever you are or whomever you are. So I think it's a challenging question for me because I don't know how to not make it about me or ask you to make it about you at this moment.
So I know that in the partnership for the Allender Center and Mr. Jimmy, you actually gave them Rachel and Dan homework before you decided to come into partnership. And you said, I want to see if you're going to do the work. Just to attach to what Mr. Derek was saying, like you have to be willing to do the work before coming to me or coming to anyone else to ask the questions. Because if you're not if I don't see that you're putting in an effort and you just want to just kind of have pity on you versus doing the work yourself, I think there's a part that you have to play before going, which I saw between the beginning of the partnership.
Oh, so she's paying attention to our conversations. I want you to know that. And it just came out, Rachel. This is your fault. Now, was that a question towards me or was that a question towards them, Michaela?
I would say, Mr. Jimmy, let's hear from you.
Well, it's funny as I listened to this question, but I listened to Derek's answer about doing the work. If I've not learned anything about being around him these last few years, is that that's one of his mantras, that I'm not going to do your work for you. And I think in terms of this issue, we need a lot of people to do a lot of work. And I think my fear is my anxiety. And over these last few days, people kept telling me, oh man, did you hear this sermon the other day? Did you hear this person say that? Well, again, that's not you doing your work. That's someone expressing their ideas of their work. And I don't think this evil that we're facing now, that's close to 400 years, it requires all hands on deck. And it requires not just white people, it requires Asian, Latino, Black, and brown. And in fact, in my conversations, Michaela, to a lot of people of color, I say we're equally at fault for white supremacy as much as white people, because we stay in silos. We don't talk to each other. We don't build coalition. And so white people come to us thinking they know more about our communities than we know about each other. And we could do a better job if we did some work for me to understand the Asian community. If we did some work as Black people to understand our Latino community, if we did some work to understand our Native situation, our coalition can help spread the responsibility and dilute the pressures that we're in. But again, it requires everybody to do work. And so that means you can't just get someone else to read a book for you. You've got to go read it. You've got to go see that movie. You've got to go see that artwork. And that's something we need to take. Yeah, we could take another question right now. We have another question from our audience. Please come on by. All right, let's see. I'll read this one. This is Albert Wang. I love this one. Oh, this is going to be beautiful. How do we decolonize the field of mental health counseling? How can we include more Black and brown voices when the white ones are so much louder? Wow. Rachel, you want to start? And then you can loft the ball up to Dan so he can hit it. Leave that question on the board too.
You want me to start?
I want you to start and loft it to Dan, because Dan, his name is the Allender Center, so I want you to loft it to him.
Well, first of all, I just want to name, I'm not a therapist, so
okay.
But I'm glad to attempt this because I think I'd say the same thing to pastors and spiritual leaders. I think, Albert, also good to see your face on here, in this, even though I know I'm not getting to interact with you. First of all, it's really hard when the field of mental health has been formed through a very particular lens. So I think in part, I would say what we're doing right now, partnerships, entrusting other voices and other people who share how they're contextualizing, decolonizing, dismantling, and also rebuilding. I think Resmaa Menakem has done this work really beautifully in My Grandmother's Hands, and taking trauma studies about the body, but helping it actually do work in a totally different context. And so I think, as hard as it will be for a lot of white people, we need to be discipled, and we need to learn from other people who are experts in their lived experience and can actually help us see what we can't see, the imagination that we lack. I keep saying this, and it's scary, but I don't actually think any of these realities can be, I think white people can participate in decolonizing things, but I don't think they can necessarily lead it.
Well, we know, I know Albert. I had many lovely conversations with Albert in class. So one of the things I would say is having a voice like yours, Albert, speaking and inviting people like me to be quiet and to actually learn, to actually be quiet enough, long enough to listen, and then to be able to be invited to a dialogue. I mean, there's always work to be done on the parts of white theoreticians, white speakers, etc. And if there's not a stance of being a learner, then you already know that in many ways that person's been colonized and also colonizing. So if there is a lack of humility, a fundamental defensiveness is always a byproduct of that sense of shame and fear, and it's also a high sign of white privilege. So wherever somebody is either guilty or defensive, they're not listening. So that openness is the invitation that we know we need to be decolonized, but we also need to be clear where our own blindness has invited us to pathologize what is not white. And once we begin to actually name, no, actually, that's a form of pathology, to be assuming you have both the knowledge and power and wisdom to be able to be an assessor and a judge of others. That's the ultimate form of arrogance. So I would say decolonization is actually decolonizing arrogance. And in that process, inviting to humility and actually to a dialogue, to a kind of mutuality that can't exist. If I'm the expert, I know you need to listen.
Michaela, let me follow up with Derek and Jen too. Go ahead, because you have aspirations.
I want to fool with the language a little bit in terms of color versus culture.
Okay.
So brown bodies and black bodies don't necessarily decolonize something, particularly when the colonization is internalized. And so the issue of decolonization is really a way of thinking differently about what it means to be human, or at least thinking in addition to. I'll give an example. If I said to you, how do we decolonize classical music? You would say, what? I don't think it's possible to decolonize counseling from its origins, if you will. But I think you can add to that. I've seen artists who will play both classic and jazz in the same sort of music piece. Mm. And so the question is how to expand our capacity as opposed to how do we pull something out? Because I think to decolonize something in this sense might be to extract maybe the guts of it to the point where it may not be useful. And then the other question is for us is what of listening is a human endeavor, but the coping strategies that I offer you as a counselor may be very culturally bound. And so to listen to you, to hear you, which I think is the heart of the work, we may not be talking about a need to decolonize listening, but we may be talking about how do we in some ways engage treatment, if you will? How do we think about the coping that I offer you, or even the frame? Or how do I understand the depth of the stories that you tell me when I'm listening? How do I understand the sort of nuances that aren't? And so I think sometimes we've got to ask the client to help us understand their world and their cultural frame, and even their coping strategies that we may not be our coping strategies, but may be very useful for them. And some of those are going to be more collectivist. We haven't talked as much about the resilience aspect of trauma. But the issue of resilience is really the issue of people. And I'll say people. So Dan talks about isolation and shame. Well, three things in resilience. People, some degree of practice that has to include your body. If you don't eat, sleep, drink well, I don't care how resilient your mind is, your body will deteriorate and your mind won't have a basis by which to do its work. And the sense of purpose, the sense of who am I and identity-wise and purpose. So I think people, and how do we engage people in their work, not isolate them individually to do work with them, but how do we include their relations, their families, their members into the sphere of the conversations we have with them, recognizing we ask them only to be individual health, that we're in some ways asking them to betray the people who would cause them or allow them to be healthier in their context. So that's some ways to fool with it. But I think we've got to be careful when we talk about brown, white, Black bodies as if inherent within them is the cultural stuff that we need to alter a white supremacy. And we're still talking about culture, not people's skin melanin.
Well, and if we're really honest in the dialogue, I'm in the process of decolonization as a way of life now, because it's all in me right now. It was nurtured, especially my Christian formation. Even though I came out of Black church, something happened to me to disengage with that part or repress that with the idea the other was greater. And so I'm renegotiating this. So the idea of decolonization is a process. That's what you're saying, Derek. It's not just because someone is brown or black or yellow or red doesn't mean that they've been decolonized just looking at the outward casing. We've got to have that outward casing and look inside and let them extract that out so we can see that there's some difference, not just by the casing. Now, I want to tap into this, and I know we're almost at 9 o'clock, but we got a couple more questions we got to ask. For the audience, you got us. But Jen and Derek, I think this question that Albert gave really lends itself to your dreams in the Seattle School and the Allender Center in terms of people of color. So now I want you to begin to talk about your aspirations when he talks about getting more people of color in the mental health space. What's your aspirations, Jen? And then Derek again. And then I got some questions, one more for you guys. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the aspirations for me is to provoke hope, right? Because I think some of the way that evil tricks us is to kind of masquerade as normal. So we have all these systems and structures and ways we understand theology and psychology that kind of tell us that a white, Western, European window of tolerance is normal. And so we kind of, or a therapist, a good therapist looks like this white, male, educated person and the way that they practice, and that's normal. And so there's not a lot of imagination. There wasn't a lot of imagination, I think, for me in the mental health field, or even in the ministry field, or even at the Allender Center when I first came. And it wasn't until I saw Susan Kim get up in front of the room and start talking about what it meant for her to be a counselor and for her to work at the Allender Center specifically with her face and her body and her story, that I started to have an imagination for, oh, this may actually be possible for me, and it's not going to look in what I thought was normal. And then I started to lean in, and I think having that, the image of Jesus through the different people that we see in front of the room teaching, through the different people that are facilitating our groups, is really important. And so I have the hope and the imagination for us to develop and train more and more facilitators who can be a part of the Allender programs, who have Black and brown and red and yellow faces and bodies. And I think we're starting to move towards that. And I'm hopeful about it, but it's hard. It's hard work. It's hard, dangerous, scary work. I'm not gonna lie, it is. So there's a cost for people to come and put themselves, in a room where it's probably going to be 80-90% majority, and for them to go through the work of looking at their story and decolonizing or learning something in a group where you may feel unsafe. I mean, that's asking a lot of people. So I think part of my imagination too is, how do we as an organization start to tackle not just some of our personal places of growth, but also those systems and structures that have felt so normal to us, that may be kind of agents of white supremacy, that actually hold elements of evil that we want to say no to.
Wow. What's your aspiration, Derek? You talk about it often, about your love for your people. I mean, you say it with passion in your heart. What's your dream as president of the Seattle School of how you can address Albert's question too in a different way.
It's interesting. I have to back away a little bit from the role of president because it is personal to me. And what my personal desire is, particularly for African Americans, is that we recognize that it has been a traumatizing experience to various degrees, personal and corporate, and that we begin to develop the resilience with that understanding. That we train people who are actually able to recognize what a trauma response is and how we get cued, not only about personal or sexual abuse or other sorts of traumas that personally have happened to us in our families, in our family tree, if you will, but also corporate, and that there be places that, this is not even a degree for me as much as training and an understanding of the impact of what it's meant for us to live in this context. I think, again, when I use the language of weathering, I was taught to weather. And even what Jen mentioned, you keep going, you don't stop. But the toll on our bodies and the toll on our spirits and the sort of self-hatred actually that arises from that, I want us healed from. And so I am wounded when, I see a man and another man of a different race callously holds his knee on a man's neck. That's wounding to me because I can see myself with that knee on my neck. I can't get that image out of my mind because that's me on the ground. I can see me. But I'm also deeply concerned about the other sort of maladaptive pieces that come out of a trauma experience that plague our community. And this may be very insiderness of me in terms of community, but I want our community healed, or have healing resources that recognize that we're not just simply facing racism, we're also facing a certain internalized colonialization that we have to engage, a colonialized shame, if you will, a wound, a hurt that should be validated. It hurts us. My God, we're not so thick-skinned. I used to fantasy that Black people have thicker skin. We are not so immune to the pain of this that we don't need healing, and that somebody recognizes that we've been hurt and can respond to that pain. And so that's my desire. And it's much more, I can't even say it's in my role as president, because quite frankly, when I go to the grave, I'll be concerned about this. And it's not about a role for me. It's as much about a sense of purpose and calling.
Michaela, they're going to give us a question in a minute, but I want to talk about why this partnership means so much to me. It's because in the impact movement, we care about Black students like you, Michaela, graduating and thriving and using your experience and impact at whatever university we're involved in to as a launching pad for the future. But I recognize this, Michaela, that in the impact movement, we're not a lot of skilled people in understanding trauma. And our deepest desire is to build a friendship with this organization that they will come alongside us in serving you and also serving our students, because our staff, because if our staff don't begin to engage the trauma that they have, they can't be any use to you. And so our hope is that there'll be some healing in our discipleship, a recognition and not avoiding this idea of evil that's present. And when I came into this job, I was watching so many Black students who were engaged in seeing these people who look like their aunts and uncles killed in the public square, and no one talked to them about it because it gave the idea that Jesus didn't care about this. It was really he cared more about names in heaven than he did about the bodies on this earth. And this partnership is to help you reconcile that Jesus can love you and live comfortably in your Black body. And there's a redeemed Blackness that needs to be expressed in our society right now. And I think that's why we need this relationship. I want you to hear that from me. And that's why I have a friendship with all four of them as well. Here's another question coming up real quick. Michaela, you can land on it.
Peter Vander Galian says, I am a Kenyan-born man adopted into a white conservative church community. How do I share my thoughts and trauma with white family members who try to use data and deflection to diminish my experiences? How do I foster relationship when they are unwilling to deeply listen, to sit with my experience when they can't accept it's different from their own?
Oh, wow.
That's good.
That's very good.
Pastor Dan, would you like to?
I'm honored to at least begin to say it's heartbreaking to hear that. Just heartbreaking, but also enraging. It's almost as if many of my white, strong, believing evangelical friends, we know that we struggle with sin personally, but somehow Christian nationalism, a kind of assumption that the structures of our society are without sin, that actually they don't bear the reality of the fall. And you want to say, is it humanly possible to think that the conglomerate, the accretion of individuals into a larger culture and system, will not have the effects of lust and anger, adultery and murder? So in part, I think, again, it's not what I'm saying is something to go and be done. I'm sure he's already done this. The heartbreak is just inviting people to look at a structure that they have to defend as if the kingdom of America is exactly the same as the kingdom of God. I mean, that's heresy. I mean, it is absolute presumption to think that America is the kingdom of God. So simply to invite looking at the reality of sin and the place of evil and culture is an invitation to actually take seriously what I assume to be a commitment to understanding the nature of evil and the nature of sin. So that would be one way, simply to invite them. Do you think America is innocent? Do you think the systems of America are innocent? Do you think our churches do not bear any effect of the plot and plan of evil? That is almost beyond me to even comprehend how someone can hold those views. But I think that the core reality of being able to say, being young versus old, you're going to be treated differently in this country. Whether you have black or brown skin, you're going to be. To actually think that's not true is such a level of denial that you have to wonder, what are they committed to keeping that they are afraid to lose? So just inviting somebody to address the question, do you actually think I'm your enemy? Do you think I'm actually opposed to you? I'm asking, what do you need to lose for you to become more of who Jesus is? Because none of us become who we're meant to be without some level of disruption.
Wow. And I don't know, that's a mental health question, but Rachel, that's a pastoral question too. He's asking to be pastored through his family. He's adopted to a family that denies his existence or his experience of life in this world. What would you do, Rachel, in that space?
I also want to invite Jen to speak to this. She's one of the best pastors I know. But I honestly, it's hard for me to move toward any kind of advice because I just feel the agony of what it would be to just be asking your parents to see your face, to just want them to want to understand you. And as a white stepmother to little boys who have a different ethnicity than me and a different racialized experience than me, I actually know it's my job in my proximity to them, in my love for them, to go above and beyond, to seek to understand something of their experience in the world that is very different than mine, and to have a posture of curiosity and like fiercely. And so I think I more just feel in my heart, I want you to have that experience. And I'm sorry. I think we could talk about all the structures that exist to protect that. I mostly just feel how insane that must, like the insanity and the cruelty it must feel. So I don't know if I have like action steps.
All right. Jen, do you want to dive into?
And I don't have really action steps either. I think the first thing that welled up in me was a protectiveness of him. Like there's a part of me that doesn't want him to go and put himself in front of such harm. And so I I don't know. I feel like I don't have really good advice. I think I feel that sense of grief and loss, and it feels overwhelming.
I mean, I'm thinking about it as a Black man, Derek, and it's a different type of tension. See, it's one thing we get to go home to our Black families, that one safety where we can live in our colloquialisms, we can have food that is relative to us. This dude here seems to be a foreigner, even in his own home, and they don't even know how to love him fully. This is agonizing.
I think, and maybe I'll fool with it a little bit. I think this is the way they hope to love him, is to make him not feel an outsider. And so the question I think that Dan asked, and I think Rachel spoke of, is my question is helping to, he'll have to, unfortunately for him, he'll have to understand what they're frightened of. And the sense of, I find that many conservative people that identify themselves as conservatives are frightened of disunity. That to bring up race and ethnicity and white supremacy is in some ways to de-unify us. So in other words, we'll fall apart, we'll fragment. So again, just talking about shame again, that we then can identify that as sin because it's fragmenting. And as opposed to, he had a distinct different experience where he's having the way people respond to his brown body. They're not recognizing that their bodies have privilege in a way his brown body does not. And that's the pain, is with his body knows something different, and they're not able to accept that because they may be frightened that it may speak of that he's different, or that suggests he's not able to be with them. But I think we've got to understand and not demonize as quickly what people are frightened of. That we sometimes will use a language of, well, they hate us. Well, I'm not sure if they hate you as much as they're frightened, and they're using hate to avoid you. And for us as people who are called to love the hate away, love the fear away, really, how do we understand what people are frightened of as opposed to seeing it only as hate? Because this hate then justifies our own response of fear, annihilation, if you will. And that's a challenge. So I don't know what to say to him either, but to say that maybe not necessarily a way they're hating him, but a way they are hoping to love him, but their fear may turn it into that. It may, as a result, be more wounding than they would hope.
Wow. You know, I search from scripture all the time to find hope for our existence. And when I came across this passage from this wise man in Ecclesiastes, I said, wow, if that's not our life. And if I can read it right now, if we can have it up front. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 4, 1-3. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors, there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not been born and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. And I think that's our trouble as oppressed and oppressed people. And maybe our best place is never to have been born than to live through it and to die. We got another question. We're going to go a little bit longer because our audience are pretty hype and I'm getting all kinds of texts. Michaela, you want to jump in?
From Corinne Vance. Empathy. What would empathy look like in dialogue between a white person and a person of color? It feels like it would be arrogant for me to think I could understand what it means to be a Black person who is scared to drive at night because she is afraid she would be pulled over. Mr. Jimmy, I want to hand that over to you.
You would hand me over to pick somebody, or you want me to ask that question?
I want you to answer that question.
Oh wow! Well, let me look at it.
I like when she's in charge.
I can see the panel. The panel is having a lot of entertainment these days. I think empathy. I think it's something to be practiced. It's not a skill that one just all of a sudden gets. And so, for instance, for myself as a man, I try to be empathetic and understanding what I put my wife through and how women feel around me. And so it's not something that I've gotten worse at. I continue to practice at it. And empathy requires knowledge. Empathy requires study. Empathy requires patience. Empathy requires humility to admit you don't know what's going on. And I think that's what people of color are wanting from white people. They want to know that your curiosity will not just be a cognitive engagement, but a visceral information that you can use and inform your body of what your body and other bodies are doing to us. You know, the image I saw the other day, I think it was in New York City or maybe DC, but there were a group of white nationalists that were engaging the protesters, and they got into a scuffle. And one of the white nationalists was beaten pretty badly. And what the whole story was about is how one of the black men picked up that white nationalist over his shoulder to carry him off to receive health care. And I said, now that should inform people that black people are not enraged that they want to retaliate. They want you to see us as fully human. And that's what empathy is doing. It's beginning to see us as human. You know, I keep thinking in my mind, there's one phrase that people think prophetically that we want to actually create something new that's never been formed, when actually what we want to do, a good prophet wants to bring what we've never experienced that was already formed. It's not something new. It's because God already had this order. And a good prophet knows the difference. It's not doing something new. It's creating something that was already intended to be, us to embrace one another's humanity. And I think that's the journey that we need to take towards empathy. Now, I got a question for the panel, since she put the whole load to me. One of my greatest fears, and I got one about white supremacy and white fragility, but I want to set that to the side. My concern now is racial fatigue. Right now, people are engaged, but you know, we've been dealing with this issue, both Native and Asian and Black and Latino, for hundreds of years. My fear is for us, how do you inform the public, people of color and white, to have the stamina and not have racial fatigue and saying, I had enough, turn the station, I don't want any more. I want to go see something different at the theater. I want to read something else in the news. I'm tired of racial fatigue. What would you encourage this audience to do to get through that? I'll start one of you. Jen, you can start.
I mean, I don't really know how to answer that question, because I think I don't have the luxury really of turning off the news or putting it aside or not really dealing with it. Like I wake up every day and I have to deal with it. It's part of my life and part of my face and part of my body. And does it wear me out? It does, but it is my faith and my body. So I have to hold it. It doesn't go away. It's not something I can set down. So I'm not really sure if I'm the right person to answer the question.
No, you're answering exactly the way it needs to be answered. Go ahead, Derek, because this is your resilience. It's all in your brain now. Go on and give some input from you.
you know, maybe it was yesterday. I was reading something, and I forget actually who it was, and I wish I could have quoted, have written it down. But the comment was, we get tired because we lose a sense of purpose, and when it feels futile and it feels we cannot see forward. And I have been tired and then gotten up, and I've been tired and gotten back up. I've been tired. And I know what's important for me to get back up is people. And I said this earlier. I need people around me to remind me that we are called towards something, and that it's not just simply you keep doing something, but that you're called towards something, and you commit yourself to being called to something larger than your own satisfaction. I think that can energize you. Even when you have to lay down to sleep and rest, it can still re-energize you to keep going. And I'm appreciative, again, for me, of newly learned practices. I know for keep going, I have to sleep. I have to rest. I need to eat differently. I don't care how energized I think I am. If I'm not taking care of my body, I won't last as long. And so there's physical pieces to this as well. And so I really deeply believe, again, the purpose is important, because then we can make meaning of stuff that feels meaningless. And I think this is something that God is ultimately saying to us, hey, in Christ, or I do all things in a certain way, but in Christ is a certain resilience, because in Christ can make sense of something. How can life come from death is what Christ says. Life can come from death is what Jesus does on the cross. That tells me I can even feel like I'm dead and still feel some sense of vibrance if I'm connected to a purpose. So for me, I think we have to take better care of ourselves. And I love fried chicken. And I love, I'm macaroni and cheese. I'm just dabbling, I'm messing with people now. But I do feel like we have to take care of our bodies as much as in some ways we sing to our souls. And so it also means holding a tune in our heart, calling on people who have gone before us, who have lived through more than we have lived through. And so there's a number of things I think we have to engage that may take us out of cultural habits that are as much about comfort, and they have to increasingly be more about resilience.
And so Rachel and Dan, so in some ways listening to both Jen and Derek, it's not only stewardship of our bodies, but realize that, you know, we do get tired, but we don't get a chance, even in being fatigued, of not being engaged. So it then implies the idea that white people can get racial fatigue, and they can say, that's it. I want to go back to my life and I don't want to engage that. And for you, Rachel and Dan, how do you encourage white people, even after the news is over? Because I hate to say it, the brother that was just shot this past weekend in Atlanta is not the last one. The body that they just found in LA hanging from a tree is not the last one. How do you encourage them to go on with us? Because I know that's what Derek and Jen are saying. We want y'all to come with us. We don't want to keep going and you left us because you were too tired. So what would you say, Rachel and Dan?
Well, I first just want to name that this is a place that's really grievous for me in my own journey. Like my lack of resilience, my lack of stamina. And to me, this just becomes a question of like, am I compelled by love or not? Do I love or not? Am I willing to be saved or not? And I think in the same way, like all the things Derek's saying, like I need people. And what's hard about that is most of the people who have something to teach me about resilience sometimes need a break from me. So I've got to find community who says, I've fixed my eyes on Jesus and I'm not looking back. And I think that's important. And I, you know, I'm reading a lot about how, like, as white people, we've got to build culture around this dismantling process, this, what it means to love differently. And that's pioneering work. And we have a lot of people to learn from. And so there's education, there's learning, there's being in relationship with people. And I also think there's taking care of your body, because part of why we as white people get fatigue is because we have trauma we need to deal with in our bodies around being perpetrators. And when Dan's mentioning shame and fear, we have to get in our bodies because those things are in us. And being in denial that they exist is not going to bring liberty, and it's not going to bring safety. We will not be safe people if we stay in denial. So we actually, it's not indulge. I don't think it's the same as like checking out and numbing, but there also has to be like, you have to be faithful in the small things to be faithful in the big things. And so there have to be practices that are cultivated to stay present, to love well, and to heal, and to keep growing and to keep moving.
The only thing I would add is Derek's remark, people, people, people. And in other words, if this is our amygdala responds with fear and shame. If all we're doing is being activated by the part of our brain that responds to fear, we will become exhausted. And as one friend put it, part of your white privilege is you can step out of this anytime you wish. But because of my face, speaking as an African-American man, he said, I can never leave this. This is part of my life. Every single day I go out into the world, but you can just blend in with whiteness. The moment you make a commitment to addressing this, you better have a community who is committed to helping you grow, mature, suffer, face your own failure without you becoming defensive or guilty, without going back to white fragility. And I can only say, if I wanted to stop moving forward, I'd have to deal with my wife, who would eat me alive. And I mean, I'm a selfish enough man to say, I live with an advocate who's passionate and whose tears and anger terrify me. I can't quit.
And you're frightened of her too, to a degree too. It has to be really honest too. All right, we have one more question too.
Alexi Resolves asks, how can an immigrant that is white from Eastern Europe who can go to the U.S. because of religious oppression can't? Who can't? Is it can't?
I think he came.
Maybe.
Who came to the U.S. because of religious oppression from the Soviet regime.
Oppression. Be an ally to racial trauma here in the U.S. Other than listening, is there something that can be done? See, this is why we're co-hosts. We help each other. Thank you.
Exactly. You're right, Michaela. That's it. Any of our panelists you want to jump in? I don't want to pick. I got 4 to pick. We got 4 to pick. Go ahead, Derek.
Just quickly, and this will be hopefully the last thing I say this evening, but I think I recognize the oppressed people recognize oppressed people in an internal way. And so it's partnership. I think this is why, in some ways, I want to be careful in the United States when we talk about oppressors as being white, as a skin tone quality, because we conflate culture and race here in this country, and that's not the way it is globally. It's not conflated in the same way, which means we may turn allies away because they're of white skin and not see the value of allies because they have a cultural experience that might not be that dissimilar in terms of oppression than your own. So I think this, there's a 2-part to that. One is find partners if you can. And the other is please be partners. Be open to partnership with people who felt and understood oppression. I think one of the insidious things that's happening right now in this country is that we cannot partner, poor people cannot partner with other poor people who happen to be of a different race. And if the society is suffering at its most, it's probably poor people of color. But we have a hard time connecting with each other because race is confounded in a certain type of way. So poor brown people, poor black people, poor white people poor yellow people. We need to, in some ways, encourage movements where those folk can get to each other and not be stifled by racial oppression, if you will. So I think there's more complexity that we have to begin to unearth in this country, and begin to, in some ways, find allies in each other in our experiences, not just simply our sense of rejection about skin tone. And I think sometimes because oh no, that's a very white person in a white body. And I mean that in both ways, a double. But recognizing that a person's had an experience that would understand mine, and how do I partner with that person?
Yeah, you know, I took students to the Balkans. Actually, I was over the program where we went to help people see white on white ethnic violence between the Serbs, the Croatians, and the Bosnians. And I had them first land in Munich to see that connection. And I think you're right and spot on that if they can leverage the oppression that they came from, that can give them the sense of vision to engage the oppression that they see in this country. And I think there's hope for that. I mean, there's a strong relationship between Jews and Blacks because of that, because the oppression of the Holocaust allows them to see the oppression of us in this country. And we have built bonds over this, you know, over centuries. Our inspiration in slavery was the Jewish text. I mean, and so I think there's plenty of hope. Well, Michaela, you want to say some thanks to some people and then I end afterwards?
We would love to thank everyone who tuned in on YouTube and on Facebook for being active in the comments and for asking questions. We thank y'all for joining us, and we hope y'all see us again in 2 weeks.
And I want to thank my partners, the Annler Center at the Seattle School, a partnership that we welcome and we need today. And to our audience today, and I think it's a large enough that I want to encourage you to think about contributions here, because we did create something in between, something that neither one of us had out of our own arsenal. And we did this before, called Race, Trauma, and the Gospel. But in the meanwhile, we cross-pollinate between trainings, between both groups. And if you desire to make a gift for some of the Impact staff to participate in the Annler Center, or for an Impact staff to go to that graduate school, I want you to consider giving a gift to us, and we would designate it for these people. Or if you want to contribute to the Annler Center coming to the training of the Impact movement, I want you to consider that. Both of us are nonprofits, and both of us have web pages that you can go to support our efforts. But I know the Impact, if we're going to grow and we want to build strong students, we're going to need partners like the Annler Center to be with us. And I mean this out of my heart. I love Derek and Dan and Jen and Rachel. You are our family. We welcome you, and we're very grateful that you allow us to be with you. And thank you tonight for being with us. So good night.
Thank you. You're a family to us too. I'll just say that here at the end. You're a family to us too.
Thank you.